The door came off its hinges at 3:02 in the morning. Three strikes from the hydraulic ram. The first bent the steel frame. The second cracked the deadbolt housing. The third tore the entire assembly free from the concrete wall in a shriek of tortured metal, and the 300-pound door fell inward like a felled tree, throwing up a cloud of pulverized concrete dust that hung in the cold October air like smoke from a battlefield. Special Agent Diane Mercer was the fourth person through the threshold. She moved fast, shoulders low, her Glock pressed tight against her chest in a high-ready position, her eyes scanning over the barrel as the SWAT operators ahead of her fanned left and right down the narrow hallway. The flashbang grenades had already gone in through the side windows, two of them detonating in rapid succession with concussions that she felt in her back teeth even from 20 feet outside. The hallway was filled with acrid white smoke and the harsh cutting beams of weapon-mounted lights. Sergeant Dale Pruitt's voice was somewhere ahead of her deep and controlled barking commands over the ringing in her ears. Police, get on the ground. Show me your hands. Get on the ground now. Mercer pushed through the smoke into the main bar area, and the world went very quiet. Not the quiet of surrender, not the chaos of men scrambling for weapons or diving behind furniture. This was a different kind of quiet entirely, the kind that didn't make sense, the kind that sent ice water flooding through your bloodstream before your brain could explain why. The smoke was still drifting lazy and white through the beam of her flashlight. Through it, shapes began to resolve. Chairs, a long oak table, men seated at that table. 25 of them arranged in a row on either side of the heavy wood like guests at a formal dinner that had been planned for weeks. Every single one of them was upright. Every single one of them had their hands flat on the table, palms down, fingers spread wide and still. And in front of each man, placed with almost ceremonial precision, was a handgun. Slides locked back, magazines ejected and placed neatly beside them. Chambers visibly empty. And beside each ejected magazine, a steaming mug of coffee. The SWAT operator stopped moving. Mercer heard the shouting die in the throats of the men around her, command words dissolving into confused silence as they swept their rifles across a room that had absolutely no intention of fighting back. Battery-powered camping lanterns sat at intervals down the center of the table. Their warm amber light made the whole scene look staged, deliberate, like a photograph someone had spent considerable time composing. The flickering shadows climbed the exposed brick walls. The smoke drifted through the lamplight in slow, unhurried curls. At the head of the table, in a high-back leather chair that might have belonged in a corporate boardroom rather than a motorcycle club, sat Conrad Briggs. He was 58 years old, and he looked exactly that age in the way that mountains look their age. Not diminished by time, but carved by it, shaped into something harder and more permanent than whatever had existed before the years worked on it. His face was a geography of old damage. A jaw that sat slightly wrong on the left side, the legacy of a bullet that should have killed him and didn't. The bone having healed not quite perfectly, leaving that side of his face with a faint, angular heaviness that you notice only when you looked at him directly and held the look long enough to understand what you were seeing. His hair was iron gray, cut close to his skull with military economy. His hands on the table were the hands of a man who had done real physical work for 30 years. Large, scarred at the knuckles, steady as poured concrete. He was wearing a plain black t-shirt. No colors, no patch, nothing that could be photographed and submitted as evidence in a federal courtroom. He looked at Diane Mercer with the patient expression of a man who had been waiting for a bus that was running 7 minutes late and had decided some time ago that impatience was not a productive response to the situation. "You're a little late," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, a sound like gravel shifting at the bottom of a dry creek bed in the last heat of summer. "Coffee's getting cold." Mercer felt the words hit her like a physical thing, not because of what they said, but because of what they meant. He had known. He had sat here in the dark in this industrial cul-de-sac in San Bernardino at 3 in the morning with 25 men arranged around him like chess pieces on a board he controlled, and he had known exactly when they were coming. He had known and he had prepared and he had waited, and now he was sitting at the head of his table, watching her come through a door he had essentially invited her to destroy. "Hands behind your heads," Pruitt roared from somewhere to Mercer's left. "Now! Fingers laced! Do it!" The 25 men moved in a way that was almost choreographed. Slowly, without hurry, without resistance, they lifted their hands from the table and laced their fingers behind their heads. Not a single man looked frightened. Not a single man looked angry or surprised or even particularly interested. They were watching the SWAT team with the calm, faintly amused expressions of people watching a magician perform a trick whose secret they already know, waiting with courteous patience for the trick to conclude. Mercer stood in the center of the room and felt something she could not immediately name moving through her chest. It was not fear exactly. It was the specific sensation of a certainty dissolving, the certainty that she had been building piece by careful piece for a very long time, the certainty that tonight was the night that everything resolved, that 3 years of work culminated here in this room in the arrest of Conrad Ellis Briggs on federal weapons trafficking charges that would end his operation permanently. That certainty was gone. She could feel exactly where it had been. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong for a very long time, and she had not seen it. She had not let herself see it. She had not wanted to. Pull back from that room. Pull back from the acrid smoke and the amber lantern light and the 25 pairs of steady eyes. Pull back to the beginning of all of it, to the summer of 2006, when Diane Mercer first opened the physical case file on Conrad Ellis Briggs in the parking lot of a federal building in Riverside, California, and felt with a certainty she couldn't yet justify and didn't yet know how to question that this man was going to define the rest of her career one way or another. She had been sitting in a government-issue sedan with the windows down because the air conditioning had given out 3 weeks earlier, and the work order to fix it was somewhere in a maintenance queue that moved at its own pace, which was not fast. It was 102 degrees outside, and she was eating a gas station sandwich and reading surveillance photographs through sweat-blurred eyes. And somewhere in the middle of a thick physical file that a previous task force had assembled and closed, without results, she came across a photograph of Briggs that someone had taken through a long lens from a highway overpass. He was sitting on the back of a motorcycle in the parking lot of a hardware store in Fontana, just sitting there, engine off, one boot on the ground, watching something off camera. He wasn't doing anything illegal. He wasn't doing anything that required any explanation at all. But there was something in the way he sat that stopped her. Something in the absolute stillness of him, the sense that every atom of his attention was focused on whatever he was looking at with a completeness that most people never achieved even in their best moments of concentration. The photograph was a still image, and yet she had the distinct impression of watching someone, think of witnessing the surface expression of a mind that was working at a speed and depth that the surroundings did not reflect. She had read his file 3 times before that morning. She could have recited it from memory. Conrad Ellis Briggs, born 1953, Riverside, California. Enlisted in the Marine Corps at 18, the same year his father died of a coronary in a machine shop in Colton, and left nothing behind except a modest life insurance policy and a reputation among the men he had worked with as someone who showed up and did what needed doing. 2 combat tours in the Middle East under conditions that the declassified portions of his service record described with the compressed language of official understatement, with 2 formal commendations for tactical leadership under fire that the same language suggested represented a significant editing down of what had actually occurred. Honorable discharge in 1977 at the rank of sergeant. Returned to the Inland Empire and spent the next 12 years working construction, building a reputation in a different context. As a man who showed up on time, worked until the job was finished, and kept his observations about other people's business to himself. Joined the San Bernardino charter of the Hells Angels in 1989 at the age of 36, which was considered old for a prospect, but which nobody who knew him apparently considered worth objecting to. Full patch in 1991. Sergeant at Arms in 1998. charter president in 2003, a position he had held since with no recorded internal challenges, which in the context of the organization was itself a significant data point. The incident that generated his street name had occurred in October of 2005. A dispute with a rival organization in the parking lot of a bar outside Fontana that had escalated into something that left two men hospitalized and one man dead. Briggs had been shot once in the left side of his jaw at close range with a .38 caliber round. The round entered below the cheekbone, shattered the mandible, and exited through the soft tissue of his neck without striking the carotid artery by a margin that the medical examiner's report described with the careful professional language of someone who had seen many things and was still surprised by this one. Two witnesses, both hostile, both subsequently uncooperative with investigators, stated independently that Briggs had looked at the man who shot him for a long moment before walking to his motorcycle, starting the engine, and riding himself to the emergency room 7 miles away. He had not asked for help. He had not made any sound that either witness described as distress. He had simply gotten on his bike and left. The attending physician at the emergency room had noted in the medical record that by the time Briggs arrived, he had lost enough blood to be clinically classified as in hemorrhagic shock. He had parked the motorcycle in a handicapped space near the entrance, walked through the emergency room doors under his own power, and told the triage nurse, and these were the exact words preserved in the documentation, that he needed someone to look at his face. Stone jaw. That was who Diane Mercer had been hunting for 3 years before Kyle Cassidy walked into her operation like a door left open in a storm. The San Bernardino charter operated out of a compound in an industrial cul-de-sac on the eastern edge of the city. The building had originally been a machine parts warehouse, a low-profile structure in a neighborhood of similar structures where nobody asked questions about the vehicles parked outside or the hours being kept. Under Briggs's direction, it had been converted over the years into something that the ATF's structural analyst reviewing satellite imagery and utility records had assessed in a report as resembling in its defensive configuration a small military installation designed by someone who understood what military installations were actually for. 12-foot chain-link fencing topped with razor wire enclosed the entire property. The windows had been bricked over from the inside. The main entrance was the 300-pound steel door that Pruitt's hydraulic ram had just torn from its housing. Surveillance cameras covered every approach angle with overlapping fields of view that left no observable blind spot from ground level. The roof had been reinforced to support the weight of men walking it, and according to the intelligence Mercer had been developing for 8 months, there were armed prospects up there on rotating shifts every night. The charter was in residence. For 3 years before Cassidy Mercer's task force had produced exactly nothing in the way of evidence that would support a federal prosecution. Every wiretap they secured yielded conversations about engine displacement and carburetor rebuild specifications and complaints about the plumbing in the club's bathroom. Every trash pull produced pizza boxes, beer cans, and receipts from hardware stores and auto parts suppliers that documented exactly the kind of activity a legitimate motorcycle repair shop would generate. The physical surveillance produced thousands of photographs of men in leather riding in formation on the freeway, which was not a crime in any jurisdiction Mercer was aware of, and showed no signs of becoming one. Briggs ran the charter with the operational discipline of a serious corporate executive who had retained from a previous career a detailed understanding of how institutional scrutiny worked and how to remain on the correct side of its effective reach. The finances were demonstrably clean. The motorcycle repair shop attached to the property generated actual documented revenue and filed accurate taxes. The members maintained employment records consistent with their parole and probation terms. When the charter met to discuss anything sensitive, they did it on handwritten notes that were burned in an oil drum behind the building, within minutes of being read a practice so low-tech and so effective that it had defeated every electronic collection capability the task force had attempted to deploy. They swept the clubhouse for listening devices every Sunday morning, rotating the responsibility through the membership so that no single person's diligence was the only barrier. They cycled through prepaid burner phones on a strict 48-hour rotation. They varied routes, meeting times, and schedules in patterns that were genuinely irregular rather than regularly irregular, which was the mistake most operations made. They did not use any electronic communication platform for anything that mattered. 3 years, a task force of 11 people. The expenditure of federal resources that Mercer had stopped calculating because the number had become demoralizing. And nothing, not a single piece of actionable evidence, not a single witness willing to testify, not a single transaction that couldn't be explained by the legitimate business Briggs had constructed as both income source and legal architecture. Then Kyle Cassidy's taillight burned out on the 215 at 11:30 on a Tuesday night in January 2009, and a San Bernardino County Sheriff's deputy pulled him over and found 2 ounces of methamphetamine and a Ruger pistol with the serial number filed off in his saddlebags. And the chain of events that would end in this smoky room with these 25 steady men and this cold coffee was set into motion. Mercer had driven to the county jail that same night. She sat across a metal table from Kyle James Cassidy for 4 hours. He was 29 years old, and he had spent the last several of those years consuming enough methamphetamine to leave a visible record on his body. Thin in the way that long-term stimulant users become thin, not the clean thinness of someone who has chosen it, but the wasting kind, the fat gone first, and then the muscle following until what remains is assembled from wire and compulsion. His eyes were pale blue, and they moved constantly tracking every corner of the interview room, with the hyper-vigilant attention of a man who had spent years in environments where violence arrived without reliable warning, and the only useful response was to never stop watching for it. He had the charter's full back patch tattooed across his left forearm, in a rendering that was technically accomplished the artwork of someone who had taken pride in the commitment it represented, done at a time when the commitment had felt permanent and defining. He was facing a mandatory federal minimum of 15 years. With his 2 prior drug convictions and the federal firearms charge added to the drug weight, the preliminary number the prosecutor's office had provided Mercer before she went in was more accurately 18 to 22. In a federal facility. Not the county lockup he had visited twice before, where the population and the rules were familiar terrain, but a federal penitentiary where he would enter as a young man and emerge if he emerged as something much older and much diminished. Mercer had laid this out for him plainly, not with the performed warmth that some investigators use to make subjects feel safe enough to talk, but with the directness of someone who respected the person across the table enough to tell them the truth about their situation without softening it into something it wasn't. She told him the number. She told him what the number meant in practice. She told him what she needed from him and what she could offer in exchange. Cassidy had cried. She had expected that. What she had not expected was how quickly the crying stopped, not suppressed, not controlled, but simply finished, replaced by something that moved behind those pale blue eyes with a speed and calculation that revised her initial assessment of him entirely. He was not, she understood in that moment, simply an addict with catastrophically bad luck. He was a man who made deliberate choices and had been making them for years, and the choice he was currently evaluating was being made with the same deliberate quality as all the others. He was deciding whether the deal she was offering was better than the alternative, and he was doing the math quickly and without sentiment. He took the deal. For the first 2 months, Kyle Cassidy was the best source Mercer had ever run. He wore a listening device buried in the reinforced stitching of his leather cut, the microphone pressed flat against the inside seam no larger than a pencil eraser, the transmitter taped against his ribs with medical adhesive. He attended club meetings. He worked the door at private events. He ran errands that moved him through different rooms of the compound at different hours. He provided Mercer with the internal security protocols in precise detail, the rotation schedule of the roof sentries, the access procedure for the basement vault that Briggs used for secure document storage, and a room-by-room description of the building's interior, so complete and accurate that the ATF's tactical team was able to construct a functional scale model in an unused storage bay at the Riverside field office and rehearse breach sequences in it. The intelligence was specific, internally consistent, and verifiable against independent sources. Mercer cross-referenced everything Cassidy provided against satellite imagery, utility records, and the sparse fragments available from other collection efforts. It held up. The task force began for the first time in 3 years to feel like people who were inside the operation they were investigating, rather than pressing their faces against opaque glass from the outside. Somewhere in early March, something shifted. Mercer had not been able to name it at the time. The shift was subtle, a change in texture rather than content, and she had been moving fast and forward and had not slowed down long enough to examine the texture of what she was receiving. Looking back later, she could identify the precise moment it began a Sunday evening debrief in which Cassidy described the agenda of a charter meeting with an unusual specificity and organizational clarity. Every topic covered in clean sequence, every discussion summarized in language that was slightly too polished for the environment it was supposedly describing. The thing she should have asked herself then, and did not ask herself, was this men who conducted business the way Conrad Briggs conducted business did not run meetings whose content could be summarized that cleanly. She had been waiting for 3 years, and the intelligence was finally flowing, and the relief of forward momentum had done what relief of forward momentum always does to careful investigators. It had made her want to keep moving rather than stop and look at what the movement was built on. She had seen confirmation in what Cassidy was giving her rather than information, had seen proof rather than evidence. And that specific fundamental error of appetite over discipline was going to cost her more than she had any framework to imagine at the time. But in October 2009, she did not know any of that yet. What she knew in October 2009 was that 8 months into the Cassidy operation, he had handed her something that felt in the particular, exhausted, hopeful way of someone who has been working toward a thing for a very long time, like the culmination of everything. He had come to her in the parking garage of a shopping center in Colton, arriving in a battered pickup truck he had borrowed because his motorcycle was in for service. He had sat in the passenger seat of her car, and his hands had been shaking. Not the pharmaceutical tremor she had seen in him in the early months, but something different. Voluntary shaking. The shaking of a man who was afraid of specific things that he could name. He had been clean for 6 weeks by that point, the first sustained sobriety he had managed in years. She had noted it in her case documentation, and she had been careful not to make too much of it, because in her experience, sobriety and reliability did not always track together in informants, and the absence of one chemical dependency sometimes created space for other forms of compromise. But she had noted it. He told her about the shipment. A Nevada source, military-grade weapons, fully automatic M4 carbines stolen from an Army logistics transport somewhere outside Las Vegas. Crates of them, Cassidy said, his voice low and his eyes moving around the empty parking garage with the attention of a man who had been taught to assume surveillance everywhere. The deal was already completed, the payment already made. The weapons were coming into San Bernardino that Thursday night, entering the clubhouse through the loading bay on the south side of the building and going directly into the basement vault. By Friday morning, distribution to buyers across multiple state lines would begin. If the ATF intended to intercept the shipment intact, it had to happen Thursday. The window was specific between 2 and 4 in the morning when the transfer would be complete, and all the weapons would be consolidated in one location before redistribution began. He had handed her a hand-drawn map of the basement. She had studied it in the dim light of the parking garage while Cassidy sat beside her, pale and controlled, in the particular way of someone using discipline to manage fear. Military-grade, fully automatic M4 carbines stolen from Army transport. That was not a drug case. That was not a racketeering case. That was a domestic terrorism prevention case. That was the kind of federal operation that generated commendations and career trajectories and justified retroactively every hour of every surveillance shift she had spent in an unmarked van with broken air conditioning, watching men ride motorcycles on the interstate. She had taken the intelligence directly to federal prosecutor Renata Voss the following morning. Voss was 50 years old, and she had spent 20 years building a professional reputation based almost entirely on technical precision, the kind of reputation that accumulated through consistency rather than spectacle, through being right more often than wrong over a long enough period that the pattern became its own argument. She was not warm in the way that some prosecutors were warm, did not cultivate relationships with law enforcement by performing enthusiasm for their work. She was demanding and rigorous and relentlessly focused on the evidentiary architecture of cases she agreed to prosecute. When Mercer laid the Cassidy intelligence on her desk, Voss read it 3 times in complete silence, her reading glasses on and her expression giving nothing away. The word she said when she looked up was airtight. She meant the warrant application. She did not mean the underlying intelligence, because she had not yet interrogated the underlying intelligence with the skepticism she would have applied in a slower moving situation. They were moving fast because the window was specific and narrow, and Voss was already drafting the warrant affidavit while Mercer was still completing her briefing, and the judge signed the warrants on Wednesday afternoon with the focused efficiency of a jurist who understood the timeline. The tactical planning consumed the following 72 hours. Pruitt was methodical in a way that Mercer found both reassuring and, in her more honest private moments, slightly intimidating. 214 high-risk warrant executions in his career without a single officer fatality. Not a statistic he mentioned himself, but one that was mentioned about him by people who worked with him in the particular tone used for facts that speak for someone's character without requiring commentary. He approached Operation Ghost Harbor with the systematic thoroughness he brought to everything, drilling the breach sequence in the scale model compound for 3 straight days, mapping every camera angle, coordinating the utility cutoff with an undercover agent positioned at the circuit breaker 2 blocks from the compound. Rules of engagement were strict in the specific way that rules of engagement are strict when the intelligence picture says the targets are trained, experienced, and prepared to use force. Multiple combat veterans in the membership. Treat them as such. No target gets more than 3 seconds to react before the space is dominated. Hit fast, hit hard. Do not give the situation time to develop in directions you have not planned for. The staging area was an abandoned cold storage warehouse 2 miles from the compound. At 1 in the morning on Thursday, 60 people stood in the dark of that building. ATF agents, SWAT operators, tactical paramedics, evidence, technicians who had been told to expect significant material to process. The diesel engines of the 3 armored Bearcat vehicles idled outside. The air in the warehouse smelled of gun oil and the specific quality of nervous adrenaline that accumulated in enclosed spaces before high-risk operations. Not quite fear, not quite excitement, something that sat between them and was the reason people either stayed in this kind of work or left it. Mercer had stood apart from the others during the final briefing, her back against the corrugated metal wall, watching Pruitt run the breach sequence on the whiteboard one final time. She was thinking with the detached clarity that comes at the end of long processes about what 3 years look like from the inside when you were finally at the end of them. What she thought was this: the marriage had not ended because of a single event. It had ended because she had been in a surveillance van or a federal building or a courthouse or an evidence room for the majority of those years. And her ex-husband had eventually said, without particular bitterness, that he had become the primary parent by default and that he was no longer willing to hold that position indefinitely while she pursued a case that showed no signs of concluding. He had not been wrong. Their daughter Lily was 14 and lived primarily with her father in Pasadena. Mercer saw her on alternating weekends when the caseload permitted, which was not a reliable frequency. The last time she had sat across a table from her own daughter was 6 weeks ago at a restaurant near her father's house, and Lily had been polite in the careful, slightly formal way of teenagers who love adults they are no longer certain they can trust. She had thought, standing in that cold warehouse at 1 in the morning, that after tonight everything was going to change. The case would close, the milestone would be established, and she was going to drive to Pasadena and spend 2 weeks being the kind of present that could not be mistaken for absence. At 2:45, the encrypted message from Cassidy arrived on her secure phone. 3 words: shipment is in. She walked to where Pruitt was standing and showed him the screen. He looked at it for 1 second and then looked at her. She nodded. At 3 o'clock exactly, the convoy rolled out without headlights. The industrial cul-de-sac was dead and dark. The city's ambient orange light layered itself into the smog above the rooftops. The Bearcats' diesel engines were a vibration more felt than heard. 40 feet from the compound, the undercover utility agent threw the circuit breaker and everything went dark. The streetlights, the neon skull visible through the bricked-over windows gaps, the exterior floodlights on the fence line. Pruitt was first out of the lead vehicle. The sniper team reported the roof clear. No sentries anywhere on the perimeter. Pruitt had registered that absence with a small controlled frown and filed it and kept moving because the tactical manual said you adapted to the situation you found, and right now the situation he found was a clear approach and a door that needed to come down. Mercer had been fourth through the threshold right on Pruitt's shoulder, and now she stood in the main bar of the San Bernardino charter with 60 federal officers and tactical operators around her. And Conrad Briggs was watching her from the head of that long table with the expression of a man watching something he had designed and built and set in motion arrive precisely on the schedule he had specified. She looked at him across the amber lamplight and the drifting smoke. She looked at the disassembled handguns and the neatly placed magazines and the coffee and the hands flat on the table and the 25 pairs of eyes that held not a trace of the fear that should have been there. She looked at the roof that had been empty when the sniper team swept it. She looked at the map Cassidy had drawn for her in the parking garage in Colton, which had described this basement in exact and accurate detail, and she thought about the word exact and the word accurate, and what those words meant when they were applied to information that came from a single source you had not verified through independent means. Conrad Briggs raised his coffee mug slightly as if in a quiet and private toast to something only he understood and took a slow, deliberate sip. Diane Mercer understood in the deepest and most unargued part of her that she had not been hunting this man. He had been hunting her. She just didn't know yet how completely he had already finished. Pruitt's operators were pulling the bikers from their chairs, now zip-tying wrists with practiced efficiency, clearing the room with the mechanical precision of a team that had done this many times in situations where it was warranted. Nobody resisted. Nobody spoke. The bikers complied with the total contemptuous cooperativeness of people who know with complete certainty that nothing currently happening to them carries any weight. Mercer left the bar and found the basement stairs. The vault door was exactly where Cassidy's map had placed it. Heavy bank vault construction, digital keypad, precisely as described. She ordered the explosive technician to burn through the locking mechanism. 60 seconds later, Pruitt kicked the door open and she went through it. The room was empty. Concrete floor, concrete walls. A single bare bulb unlit above her. No crates, no weapons, no evidence of recent storage. The room smelled of old dust and undisturbed time, except for the folding chair in the center of the floor, and Kyle Cassidy sitting in it, and the cassette tape recorder on the floor at his feet, and the photographs covering every inch of every wall from floor to ceiling. Cassidy looked up at her. His face had the color and texture of old ash. He was shaking with a fine, continuous tremor. His hands knotted together in his lap, his pale blue eyes showing too much white around the iris. He was not restrained. He was not injured. He was sitting in a concrete room covered with photographs of Diane Mercer's life, and he looked like a man who had been waiting for something terrible and was experiencing the specific relief of someone for whom the terrible thing has finally arrived and uncertainty has at last been replaced by something definite, even if the definite thing is awful. Mercer moved her flashlight across the wall slowly. A photograph of her crossing the parking lot of Lily's school, taken from above and behind her daughter, visible beside her with one hand raised pointing at something that had caught her attention. A photograph of Dale Pruitt in the passenger seat of his personal vehicle, his wife in the driver's seat, both of them in the middle of a conversation that was making her laugh. A photograph of Renata Voss in a courthouse hallway, Mercer recognized taken through a glass door from an angle that suggested the photographer had been stationary and patient. Photographs of Mercer's surveillance van taken from multiple rooftop angles, each one demonstrating clearly how visible the vehicle had been from the compound's elevated positions. Printed transcripts of conversations from lines that were supposed to be secure. On the floor, the cassette player clicked and began. Her own voice filled the concrete room. The voice was from the classified tactical briefing held 3 days ago in a secured federal facility in Riverside. She heard herself saying things she remembered saying in a room that had contained only authorized personnel and no recording devices of any kind. She ejected the cassette and put it in an evidence bag before the tape finished rewinding. Procedure. That was what you had. She did not look at Cassidy while she did it. Then she looked at him. Tell me everything, she said. From the beginning. All of it. It took him 40 minutes. He told it in fragments, doubling back, losing the thread, recovering it. She did not interrupt him. She stood against the wall and listened, and let the full architecture of it build itself in her understanding piece by piece. The way a structure that has been there all along becomes visible once you finally know what you are looking at. Briggs had found the listening device in March. Not through a sweep, the device was correctly concealed and beyond the capability of the sweep equipment the charter had available. He had found it through inference. He had watched Kyle Cassidy over the course of a week at regular club activities and had observed in the accumulation of small behavioral signals that Cassidy could not fully describe in retrospect that the young man was carrying something specific. Not the ordinary ambient fear of a prospect in a serious organization, which was a baseline condition and well understood by everyone. Something more directional. The fear of a person maintaining a secret and aware at every moment of the cost of its discovery. Briggs had not confronted him. He had not searched him or changed his behavior in any observable way. He had simply continued watching for 2 additional weeks with the patient, total attention of a man who had spent years in situations where accurate reading of other people was not a professional skill, but a survival requirement. By the end of those 2 weeks, he had seen enough to be certain. Then he had made his decision. Not to kill Cassidy, not to expose him or shut down the operation or go dark. He had made the decision that Cassidy described now in the basement with a quality of retrospective horror that had not diminished with time as the most frightening decision a man like Briggs could make. He had decided to use what had happened as an instrument. He had sat down next to Cassidy one evening in the empty club kitchen and explained the situation without raising his voice. He told Cassidy that he knew. He told Cassidy what the normal consequence of that knowledge was. And then he offered an alternative, and the alternative required Cassidy to be, for an extended period, the most convincing actor he had ever been. Cassidy had not hesitated. He would have agreed to nearly anything at that moment, and Briggs had understood that and used it with precision. From March through September 2009, every piece of intelligence that Cassidy delivered to Mercer's task force had been written by Conrad Briggs. The basement layout, the roof sentry schedules, the security protocol details that Mercer had spent weeks cross-referencing and found to be accurate in the ways that were independently verifiable, constructed in the ways that mattered. A perfect mixture of truth used as scaffolding for fabrication, designed to be undetectable precisely because the true elements were genuinely true. The photographs on the walls had involved charter members conducting counter-surveillance on the task force for months, following vehicles, noting addresses and routines, documenting patterns. The photograph of Mercer at Lily's school had been taken from the roof of a building across the street by a man who had been patient enough to wait for the right moment. The photograph of Pruitt's wife had been taken from a moving vehicle at low speed. None of it was technically illegal. All of it was a message delivered in a language that required no translation. The briefing recording required the most explanation. Briggs had not penetrated a secured federal facility. He had not sent anyone through Mercer's security perimeter. What had happened was simpler and in its way more unsettling. Briggs had understood that if the operation reached a courtroom, The prosecution would lean heavily on the recording as evidence of sophisticated criminal counterintelligence against federal agents. He had also understood that the way to neutralize that narrative was not to prevent the recording from existing, but to ensure that when it surfaced, the fingerprints on it belonged to the wrong person. He had instructed Cassidy to buy a digital voice recorder at a retail electronics store, to pay cash, to make the purchase on a specific Wednesday when the store's security cameras were confirmed operational, to bring the recorder to his next scheduled meeting with his ATF handlers and activate it before the meeting began. Cassidy had done all of it. He had sat in the room during Mercer's classified tactical briefing with a $39 recorder in his jacket pocket, and he had done it with a device he had purchased on camera for which he had the receipt in his wallet at this moment. In a courtroom that was not evidence of Briggs's guilt. It was evidence of Cassidy's. Mercer walked back upstairs. The main bar had become a bureaucratic situation with no clean resolution. 25 zip-tied men seated against the wall. No weapons found, no drugs, found no evidence of any criminal activity. Every firearm photographed and checked, every registration coming back clean. The charter's attorney was 20 minutes out. Outside, she could hear the helicopters before she reached the destroyed entrance. 3 of them hovering above the industrial park with spotlights cutting through the smog news vans, visible at the perimeter barricades, with camera operators already framing their shots. Briggs had tipped them. She understood that without needing confirmation. And what the cameras were recording for the 6 o'clock news was not a heroic federal task force preventing a domestic arms deal. It was 60 heavily armed law enforcement personnel having apparently found nothing in a private building except middle-aged men who had been drinking coffee. Voss called at 6:04 in the morning. "You told me we had military hardware," Voss said. Her voice was the cold, flat register of controlled anger. "You told me we had a weapons trafficking case. I have the ACLU calling my office. I have zero probable cause to hold any of these men past 8 o'clock, and I am looking at lawsuit exposure that will occupy civil rights attorneys in this district for years." "They surveilled us," Mercer said. "They have photographs of my daughter. They have a recording from a classified briefing. That proves they're smarter than you," Voss said, "which is not a federal crime. Cut them loose. All of them. Before 7. Pruitt cut the zip ties himself. Down the row without speaking, slicing each one with a folding knife, and each man stood and collected his legally registered and demonstrably empty firearm and walked out through the destroyed entrance into the flash of press cameras. Briggs was the last one released. He stood in the ruined threshold, one hand resting lightly on the bent steel of the door frame, and looked at Diane Mercer for a long moment with an expression she could not categorize. Then he looked at the cameras. Then he looked back at her. "Get some sleep," he said quietly. "You look like you need it." He stepped through the threshold and walked into the press line and said nothing to anyone, and the story assembled itself around his silence. The formal fallout began within 48 hours. The ATF's Internal Affairs Division opened an investigation into Mercer's task force on Friday afternoon. The allegations were procedural, inadequate verification of informant intelligence, insufficient, independent corroboration, potential misrepresentation to the issuing judge. Bureaucratic language for a bureaucratic failure. And behind the language, the clear and specific implication that her career was entering a suspension of indeterminate length. Pruitt was placed on administrative leave pending psychological evaluation following an incident in the precinct debriefing room that involved a chair and a window. Mercer had not been present for it, but had heard the account from 3 separate people by the end of that day. The news coverage set the narrative within hours. Operation Ghost Harbor, federal overreach, flawed intelligence paramilitary force deployed against men found to have committed no crime. The images of zip-tied bikers against the wall circulated nationally by Friday morning. None of this was what broke Mercer's concentration. What broke it was the log. She had not slept between Thursday night and Saturday morning, working through the task force's documented intelligence for 8 months, looking for the places where the seam showed, now that she knew what had been constructed and what had been real. She found them everywhere once she understood what she was looking for, the way certain pieces of information had arrived at precisely the moments most needed to sustain her momentum, the way the Nevada shipment story had materialized at exactly the point when her superiors were beginning to question the task force's output relative to its expenditure. She had been managed, handled with patience and precision, fed exactly what she needed to keep moving in the direction she was already inclined to move. And the recognition of it was a specific kind of humiliation that sat in a part of her chest she was going to have to find language for eventually. At 4 in the morning on Saturday, she pulled the port traffic records for the Long Beach container terminal. Not from suspicion. She was examining everything she had taken for granted, and the port records were adjacent to the case file and accessible. She almost missed it. Buried in the routine manifest log for October 23rd. At 3:17 in the morning, 17 minutes after the breach team had gone through the clubhouse door, a freight processing clerk named Howard Greer had logged 3 shipping containers through the terminal's secondary inspection lane. The inspection status notation read Deferred Port Authority Authorization Pending. The signature line for the authorizing port official was blank. Mercer stared at that entry. In normal circumstances, a deferred inspection with a missing authorization signature was a minor administrative irregularity, the kind of thing resolved within 48 hours by a supervisor signing retroactively. But the circumstances were not normal, and the timing was not coincidental, and she knew both of these things with a certainty that arrived before she had fully articulated the argument for it. She pulled the container numbers and ran them through the federal cargo tracking system. Manifest listed industrial electrical components. Country of origin inconsistent across 2 fields of the same document. Consignee listed as Hargrove Pacific Logistics, registered address in a commercial district near the port. She searched Hargrove Pacific Logistics in the California Secretary of State's Registry. Incorporated 2001. Regular annual filings, consistent registration fees. A functioning logistics business with no surface anomalies. She wrote the name and the incorporation date on a notepad and looked at them. 3 containers, unsigned authorization. 17 minutes after she had sent 60 officers to break down a door 7 miles away. She took the notepad to Renata Voss on Monday morning. Voss looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Mercer. Then at the notepad again. The jury deliberates Thursday, Voss said. If I introduce new materials now, Slade files for a continuance and I give him grounds. We have what we have. Don't you want to know what was in those containers, Mercer said. Voss folded the notepad and handed it back. Right now what I want is a conviction. Deal with the containers after. Mercer took the notepad and left. She did not stop working the container angle. She worked it in the mornings before the office opened, and the evenings after she left it parallel to the trial preparation, using databases she had legitimate access to, and filing records requests that were individually unremarkable. She was building something, and she was building it the way you built things that needed to survive scrutiny from people who had reasons to look for weaknesses. The trial of the United States versus Conrad Briggs opened on a Monday in November 2009 in Federal District Court in Riverside. The gallery was full every day. Voss at the prosecution table, composed and technically precise, her reading glasses on a chain. Her opening statement, a clean architectural account of a 3-year investigation, a cooperating informant in a criminal organization that had run counterintelligence operations against federal agents. At the defense table, Raymond Slade. Slade was 55 and had spent 12 years as a federal prosecutor before he crossed over, which meant he understood the government's methodology from the inside and knew not just where the arguments were made, but where the foundations could be reached. He was not dramatic. He did not perform. He was patient and methodical, and the quality that made him genuinely formidable was the specific patience of someone who never reached for a point before the ground beneath it was fully prepared. His opening was brief. The case rested entirely on the testimony of a man facing federal prison whose freedom depended on providing information significant enough to justify a major operation. The question for the jury was whether the false information he had provided reflected a conspiracy directed by Conrad Briggs or a fabrication constructed by a desperate man to stay out of a cell. Kyle Cassidy took the stand on the second day. He looked better than he had in the basement, 2 months of sobriety showing in his face the worst of the chemical erosion receding. Dark blue suit, pale blue eyes, steadier than Mercer had seen them. Voss led him through the testimony with careful precision, the recruitment, the counter-surveillance operation, the false Nevada shipment, the map, the photographs, Briggs's direction of every element. It was compelling. Mercer watched the jury absorb it and saw the engagement there, 12 people leaning into a story that was specific and dramatic and had the texture of truth. Then Raymond Slade stood up. He set a single sheet of paper on the lectern and looked at Cassidy for a moment without speaking. Mr. Cassidy, you are a methamphetamine addict with 2 prior drug convictions. I was. I'm clean now. Congratulations. And when Agent Mercer approached you in January 2009, you were facing a mandatory federal minimum of 15 years. Yes, your freedom, your physical freedom, depended entirely on providing information significant enough to justify a major operation. Yes or no? Yes. Slade walked a document to the judge's bench. Defense Exhibit C, a receipt from a Radio Shack in downtown San Bernardino, dated 3 days before the raid. A digital voice recorder model, DS2600, $38.99 paid in cash. Defense Exhibit D, security camera footage from the same Radio Shack, date and timestamp showing Kyle Cassidy at the register. Defense Exhibit E, a fingerprint analysis confirming the only prints on the recorder recovered from the basement vault were consistent with Kyle Cassidy's right hand. The courtroom went quiet in a particular way. Mr. Cassidy, Conrad Briggs did not plant a recording device in a federal facility. He coached me to buy it. He told me exactly, you bought a recorder at a retail store. You paid with your own money. You carried it into a federal building in your own pocket and activated it yourself. No one was standing beside you at that register. He told me what you are asking this jury to believe. Slade said, his voice carrying no elevation at all, is that a man sophisticated enough to run a multi-month counterintelligence operation against a federal task force would direct his own informant, the one person in the entire organization whose cooperation with federal agents was already established, to personally purchase, personally transport, and personally operate the only recording device involved, leaving his own fingerprints on it and keeping the receipt. Cassidy's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Isn't it far more likely, Slade continued, that you bought that recorder on your own initiative because your handlers were growing skeptical of your value and you needed something dramatic to keep yourself out of federal prison? That is not what happened. You fabricated the Nevada shipment. No. You fabricated the basement map. Briggs left it on my bunk. Did anyone witness Mr. Briggs place that map on your bunk? A fraction of a second's hesitation. No. Did anyone witness Mr. Briggs give you any instruction about false intelligence at any time? Another hesitation. No. Slade turned to face the jury directly. The only evidence connecting Conrad Briggs to any of the alleged deception is the testimony of a man whose freedom depended entirely on keeping his government handlers satisfied. Every physical piece of evidence in this case, the recorder, the receipt, the fingerprints, bears Kyle Cassidy's name alone. He returned to the defense table and sat down. Mercer watched the jury's faces absorb what had happened, watched the story she had been building shift on its axis in 20 minutes. Watch 12 people look at Cassidy sitting on the stand in a suit that fit poorly, his pale eyes unable to settle, and then look at Conrad Briggs sitting at the defense table taking notes on his yellow legal pad with the methodical calm of someone documenting a business meeting. Briggs wrote something, set down his pen, folded his hands, and waited for the next witness. Mercer left during the lunch recess and sat in her car in the parking structure. She was not falling apart. She was thinking. The Hargrove Pacific Logistics Incorporation date was January 2001. She had run the directing attorney information from the paralegal service that had filed the documents. The attorney had been a partner at Whitmore and Associates, a San Bernardino County firm that had dissolved in 2004. In the California State Bar's archived records, one of the three named partners of Whitmore and Associates from 1998 through 2003 had been an attorney named Renata Voss. She had been sitting with that information for 36 hours before the trial began. A prosecutor who had worked at a firm that handled a corporate incorporation 8 years ago was not automatically corrupt. Commercial attorneys incorporated dozens of companies yearly for dozens of clients. Voss may never have known the beneficial owners of Hargrove, may never have had contact with the company after its incorporation. The connection meant nothing on its own, but it was a thread. And she was the kind of person who pulled threads. She had cross-referenced Hargrove's manifest dates against the task force's operational log going back to 2003 and found 4 instances across 6 years where significant Hargrove shipments cleared Long Beach during periods when ATF and related agency surveillance resources were concentrated inland. 4 times in 6 years, not once. 4. She had not said anything to Voss. She had put everything into a file on her personal laptop behind a password she had not shared, and she had kept working. The parking structure elevator opened and Renata Voss walked out. She noticed Mercer and stopped. "Jury's still out," Voss said. "Could go either way. Slade did real damage." "I know," Mercer said. Voss studied her for a moment with the evaluating expression of a highly intelligent person deciding how much to say. "Whatever happens in there, Diane, the IA review is the investigation that matters now. I'm going to speak to the review board directly about the intelligence verification process. Characterize it as a systemic failure in oversight protocols, not individual negligence. That protects both of us." "Both of us," Mercer said. Voss held her eyes for a moment. Then she clicked her key fob and got into her car and drove out of the parking structure. Mercer sat with the word both. Prosecutors did not typically frame their exposure and a field agent's exposure as parallel concerns requiring coordinated management unless both parties were genuinely exposed to something real. Voss's use of both was not careless. Nothing Voss said was careless. Mercer took out her phone and added a note to the private file. Then she went back upstairs to hear the verdict. 4 hours of deliberation. Not guilty on all counts. The gallery erupted. Briggs shook Slade's hand with composed satisfaction. Mercer sat in the gallery and let the sound wash over her and did not move until the room was nearly empty. Then she heard deliberate footsteps on the carpet and Conrad Briggs stopped at the end of her row. He stood there with his jacket buttoned and his legal pad under one arm and looked at her the way you look at something that has cost significant time and attention and is now resolved. She looked back. "You still don't see the board, Diane," he said. "You're only looking at the pieces." She said nothing. "You threw 60 operators, 3 helicopters, and your entire surveillance division at my front door at 3 in the morning. He paused. "While you were doing that, nobody was watching the docks at Long Beach. 3 shipping containers. 3:17 in the morning. Every law enforcement asset in Southern California was standing on my lawn." He let that land. "You didn't raid me," he said quietly. "You guarded me." Then he turned and walked up the aisle and disappeared through the oak doors without looking back. Mercer sat alone in the empty courtroom. She was not thinking about the verdict. She was not thinking about Briggs. She was thinking about the word both and about a logistics company incorporated in 2001 and about 3 containers that moved through a port at 3:17 in the morning without a signed authorization, while 60 federal officers stood 7 miles away on a man's lawn. She thought about the fact that she had spent 3 years hunting Conrad Briggs and had never once considered that the most dangerous person in proximity to this case might not be him. She took out her phone and opened the private file. Then she began to work. The private file had 17 entries by the time she drove out of the courthouse parking structure, and every one of them pointed in the same direction. She went home and slept for 5 hours. When she woke at 4 in the morning, she made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and her notepad and worked for 6 hours straight. The internal affairs investigation of her task force opened formally that week. The review board requested all operational documentation, all informant handling records, all communications with the issuing judge. She provided everything completely and correctly. Her protection against the review was the fact that everything she had done had been done according to established protocol. The failures were failures of judgment applied within correct procedure, and that distinction between a judgment failure and a procedural violation was the specific distinction that would determine whether her career survived the review or ended in it. Voss called twice during the first week. Mercer returned neither call. While IA worked its process, Mercer worked hers. She requested access to the Port Authority's internal authorization records for October 23rd through the ATF's Financial Crimes Liaison Office, a channel outside Voss's jurisdiction and below the level of scrutiny the IA review was generating. The request took 3 weeks. When the records came back, they confirmed the unsigned authorization. The port official responsible for the secondary inspection lane that night was a cargo processing supervisor named Gerald Fitch, 11 years at the Long Beach terminal. Mercer ran Gerald Fitch's financials. In March 2009, 8 months before the raid, Gerald Fitch had paid off a second mortgage on his home in Lakewood, $74,000. The transaction record listed the source as a personal loan from a private individual. The name of the private individual was not recorded because personal loans between private parties did not require federal reporting unless they exceeded a threshold that this transaction had been structured to fall below by approximately $800. Mercer sat with that for a long time. She was not going to take this to Voss. She was not going to take it to the ATF field office because the field office was currently investigating her, and anything she brought through that channel would be filtered through the lens of an agent trying to deflect from her own failures. She was not going to take it to the U.S. Attorney's Office because that office had a decade-long working relationship with Voss and institutional relationships of that duration, and depth did not redirect easily in response to accusations from agents under active review. She was going to the FBI, specifically to the Financial Crimes Division, which had independent statutory jurisdiction over public corruption and which operated in a lane deliberately separated from the ATF and the federal prosecutor's office by design. She had a contact there, an agent named Terrence Brubaker, whom she had worked with on a money laundering referral in 2007, and trusted in the specific functional way that you trust someone whose professional judgment you have observed directly under conditions that tested it. She called Brubaker on a Tuesday morning in December from a parking lot 2 miles from her apartment using her personal cell phone. She told him what she had. Not everything enough to establish that she was not calling with a theory, but with documented, sourced, verifiable material connecting a federal prosecutor to a shell company, a port official to a structured payment, and both connections to a specific uninspected shipment on a specific night. She told him she needed someone outside her chain of command to evaluate it. Brubaker was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Send me everything. Physical copies, not email. I'll look at it this week." She drove to a copy shop and made 3 sets. Mailed one to Brubaker's office, secured the other 2 separately. Then she went back to work. Pruitt returned from administrative leave in late November, cleared by psychological evaluation with a finding of acute stress response that did not indicate ongoing fitness concerns. He was not the same as he had been before the raid. The stillness was still there, but accompanied now by something heavier, a quality in the set of his jaw, in the way he calculated the cost of words before speaking them. He came to find her in the task force office on a Thursday afternoon in early December, sat across the desk from her. The silence between them was the silence of people who had been through something together and were still in the process of understanding what it had taken from each of them. He said, "I heard Briggs made a comment about my daughter when he left." She said yes. He was quiet. Then how close did they get? She told him about the photograph. Rooftop angle, careful composition. His daughter's face clearly identifiable. He was quiet for a longer time. Then what are you working on? She told him she was following financial anomalies connected to the night of the raid. She did not tell him about Voss. He was still under administrative review, and she was not going to put him in a position where he would have to report a conversation with her to the board. He looked at her steadily. You know, he said the thing about Briggs that I keep coming back to is how long everything takes. The counter-surveillance, the informant management, the press timing, none of it improvised. All of it built over months or years. He studies his ground before he moves on it. Mercer said, that's right. So whatever he's moving now, Pruitt said he's been setting it up for a while. He paused. Just something to think about. Then he stood and left. Mercer sat for a while thinking about what he had said. Cassidy had entered a residential treatment program in Nevada the week after the verdict. 60 days residential, no outside communications for the first 30. Mercer had noted the program's name and address and intake date. She had no legal basis for contact and no current need for his testimony. But she had noted it because Cassidy was the one person in this entire sequence of events who was genuinely frightened of Conrad Briggs. And frightened people sometimes became useful at moments that were difficult to predict in advance. The Hargrove investigation took 6 weeks. She worked it before the office opened, and after she left it using legitimate database access and records requests that were individually unremarkable, even if their cumulative direction was specific. She was meticulous. Every finding dated and sourced. Every inference labeled as inference and distinguished from documented fact. She built it the way you built a case for a jury of people who had no reason to trust you and every reason to look for weaknesses. Hargrove Pacific Logistics had 2 beneficial owners. One was a Nevada LLC that traced through 2 corporate layers to a Las Vegas real estate development company with no apparent connection to anything she was investigating. The other, holding 40% of the equity, was a trust established in Delaware in the year 2000 under the name Clearwater Management Holdings. The trustee was a private trust company in Wilmington. The named beneficiary, the individual whose assets the trust legally represented, was listed in the trust's founding documents, part of the Delaware Public Record, as RV. 2 initials. She stared at them on her screen. She spent 3 days establishing whether any legitimate pathway led from those initials to Renata Voss's name in a way that would survive independent scrutiny. She found it in the Delaware Bar Association's archive pro-hack vice admissions. In 2000, a year before the Hargrove Incorporation, Renata Voss had been admitted to practice temporarily in Delaware for the purpose of establishing a private trust. The admission record named the trust Clearwater Management Holdings. It was Voss's trust. Voss was RV. Voss held 40% of the beneficial interest in a logistics company that had been moving uninspected cargo through Long Beach for 6 years, including 3 containers on the night of October 23, 2009, when 60 federal officers were standing in a concrete warehouse in San Bernardino, based on intelligence that Voss had evaluated, approved, and helped rush through the federal court system. Mercer assembled the complete file on a Friday evening in January 2010. 47 pages organized chronologically, each document annotated with a paragraph explaining its evidentiary significance. She made 4 copies and called Terrence Brubaker at 7 in the morning on a Saturday. He answered on the second ring. "I have the complete package," she said. "Are you ready for it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I've been looking at what you sent in December. There's enough here to open a formal inquiry. If the Delaware Trust documentation is what you're describing, this doesn't stay at the field level. This goes to the division chief." "I know. Diane, I need you to understand what you're doing. A sitting federal prosecutor. This will be the most scrutinized referral this division sees in years. Everything needs to be completely clean." "It's clean. Send it Monday. Physical copies. I'll schedule a briefing for Wednesday." She drove to the copy shop and made the 4th set, mailed 3 sets to separate addresses, and locked the 4th in a fireproof box in her apartment. Then she went to a diner near her apartment and ate breakfast alone and looked out the window at the January morning. She thought about the 3 years in the surveillance van. She thought about the door coming off its hinges, the amber lantern light, Briggs raising his coffee mug in that quiet private toast. She thought about the photographs on the basement walls, her daughter's hand raised pointing at something she found interesting. That afternoon, innocent, invisible, and documented by a man who had been patient enough to position himself on a rooftop and wait for the right moment. She thought about the courthouse parking structure and Voss saying both with the precise, weighted inflection of someone deploying a word that carried specific and calculated meaning. She thought about Conrad Briggs standing at the end of her row in the empty courtroom, telling her she had been guarding him. He was right. She had been. She had given 3 years in her marriage and her relationship with her daughter and her professional standing to a pursuit that Briggs had been directing from the inside. And she had been a piece on his board moved with patience and precision toward a purpose she had not known existed. But Briggs had not planned for Renata Voss to say the word both in a parking structure to a woman who noticed things and wrote them down. He had not planned for a missing signature in a Port Authority log to survive the standard review period long enough to be found by someone looking for it. He had not planned for the Delaware Public Record to retain a pro-hack vice admission from the year 2000, or for the paralegal service to keep client matter records for 10 years as a matter of standard practice. He had built something extraordinary. He had thought about nearly everything. He had not thought about everything. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division opened a formal inquiry into Renata Voss on a Wednesday in February 2010. Sealed, not public. Voss, not notified. The investigative process for a sitting federal prosecutor moved slowly and carefully and out of sight, which was by design. Mercer was interviewed twice by Brubaker's supervisor, a division chief named Wallace Greer, who had been with the Bureau for 24 years, and who asked questions with the quiet, methodical precision of someone who had learned to find the weight-bearing elements of a structure by pressing on things gently until something moved. She answered every question completely and accurately. She did not speculate beyond what the documents supported. She gave them the file and let it stand on what it was. Her IA review concluded in March 2010. She had followed informant handling protocols correctly throughout the operation. The failure of those protocols to detect a counterintelligence operation of Briggs's sophistication represented a systemic gap requiring policy-level attention, not a personal violation, not individual negligence. The finding placed her in a desk assignment pending task force restructuring a holding pattern, not a terminal outcome. Pruitt was restored to full operational status the same week. He called her when he got the news. The call lasted 4 minutes. He told her he was glad. She told him she was glad. They did not say much else. They did not need to. Cassidy completed the residential program and was discharged in February. He called her once in early March, his voice carrying a quality of deliberateness she had not heard in it before, the anxious, darting quality absent, replaced by something more settled. He said he was going to stay in Nevada for a while. She told him that sounded like a reasonable plan. The call lasted 7 minutes and ended without drama. Two people who had been significant to each other in damaging ways, acknowledging that the thing between them was finished. She never heard from him again. The FBI inquiry ran for 8 months. Mercer was not briefed on its progress. She continued her desk assignment, continued the container research as a private project, and waited with the specific patience of someone who had learned through the experience of losing badly what patience actually costs and what it is actually worth. In October 2010, exactly 1 year after the night of the raid, Renata Voss resigned her position as federal prosecutor. The resignation came in a brief press release from the U.S. Attorney's Office, citing personal reasons. 1 day of modest coverage in the legal press. 2 weeks later, a quieter announcement from the Department of Justice. Voss was cooperating with an ongoing federal investigation into financial irregularities connected to the Long Beach Port Authority. The investigation was described as relating to cargo inspection practices. No additional subjects named. Mercer read the announcement in the kitchen of her apartment at 6 in the morning and sat with it. Voss was not going to be the headline. She was not going to be the scene in the courtroom where justice arrived with proper weight at the right moment. She was going to be a cooperation agreement and a financial penalty and a disbarment preceding the institutional machinery of accountability working at its own speed and its own language. It was not satisfying in the way that 3 years of hunting a man had felt like it should be satisfying when she believed she was close to finishing it. But it was real. Conrad Briggs was never charged. There was nothing to charge him with. The 3 containers had cleared the port under the Hargrove name, and whatever they had contained had dispersed into commerce through channels that were now impossible to trace. The financial connection between Briggs and Hargrove's Nevada LLC structure was never established to prosecutorial standard. He existed as he had always existed in the space between what was known and what could be proved, and that space was where he lived and moved and would apparently continue to live and move for as long as he chose to occupy it. Mercer had known this for months before the Voss announcement. She had made something like peace with it during the long hours of the desk assignment. Briggs had beaten her. He had beaten the case. He had used her and the ATF and the federal court system as instruments of his own operation with a precision and patience she could recognize, and in the most honest part of her self-respect, in the specific way that you respect the thing that outmatched you. Because respecting it is the only honest response to it, and the only way to learn something useful from the experience. She requested a transfer to the Bakersfield field office in November 2010. It was not a career-advancing move. Bakersfield was a smaller office with a lighter caseload and less visibility. Colleagues assumed it was the IA review's long shadow manifesting as a voluntary relocation. She did not correct that assumption. The real reason was 47 miles up Interstate 5 in Pasadena, where her daughter was halfway through her sophomore year of high school and had said in a phone call 2 weeks earlier, in the quiet, careful voice of someone who had been disappointed enough times to be cautious about hope, that she would like it if they could have dinner more regularly. Mercer drove to Bakersfield on a Sunday in December with her car packed and her new apartment already arranged and stopped in Pasadena on the way. She and Lily ate at a Mexican restaurant near Lily's school and talked for 3 hours. Lily showed her a history project about post-war infrastructure and asked questions that were genuine, and told Mercer things about her own thinking that Mercer had not been present enough to know existed. They did not talk about the raid or the trial or the IA review or any of the things that had consumed the previous year. They talked about the project and a book Lily was reading and whether the restaurant's green sauce was better or worse than the restaurant from 6 weeks ago. And the conversation was ordinary in the specific, irreplaceable way that ordinary things become when you have been absent from them long enough to understand what their absence actually costs. When Mercer got back in her car and drove north toward Bakersfield in the December evening, the freeway was nearly empty. She drove with the window cracked and the heater on low and thought about Briggs the way you think about weather that has already passed, acknowledging it, not living in it. And then she stopped thinking about him and thought about Lily instead, about the green sauce, about a history project she hadn't known existed until that evening. The San Gabriel Mountains were dark shapes against the sky. That was enough. She arrived in Bakersfield at 10, carried boxes from the car in 2 trips, the December air cold enough to see her breath. The apartment was small and smelled of fresh paint, and the heating system made a sound when it cycled on that she would eventually stop noticing. She unpacked her laptop and her notepad in the fireproof lockbox with the 4th copy of the Hargrove file, which she put in the bedroom closet. Then she set up the coffee maker because the coffee maker was always the first thing, and she sat at the kitchen table and looked at the blank wall opposite and listened to the new apartment find itself around her. She did not open the laptop. She did not open the notepad. She sat at the table and drank coffee and let the quiet be quiet, which was harder than it sounded for someone who had been in continuous motion for 3 years, but which she was beginning to understand was its own kind of work and its own kind of discipline. On the wall across from her, there was nothing. No photographs, no surveillance maps, no timelines marked with colored thread connecting one piece of evidence to another in a pattern she was trying to make legible. Just a wall in a small apartment in a city 47 miles from her daughter. In the morning, she would go to the Bakersfield field office and introduce herself and begin learning the terrain of a new place. She would be for a while the agent who ran Ghost Harbor, and she would carry that the way you carry a scar, not hidden, not displayed, just present, part of the geography of what she was now. In the morning, there would be new work and new cases, and the particular texture of starting in a place where nobody knew what you had been through or what it had cost. But that was in the morning. For now, there was only the December quiet and the sound of the heating system and a city she did not yet know settling around her like something that might, given enough time, become home. Some men are too smart to catch, but every king needs a board. And sometimes the only move left when you have lost every piece and the game is finished and the other player has walked out of the room without looking back is to walk away from the wreckage yourself and build something that cannot be taken from you. Something made not of warrants and surveillance logs and informant reports, but of the slow and hard-won understanding of exactly where you are, exactly what you know, and exactly what you are willing to do next. Diane Mercer finished her coffee. She rinsed the mug and set it on the counter and turned off the kitchen light. She went to bed. She slept without dreaming for the first time in a year.